Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the May Advanced View program for the Association of Fraternity Sorority Advisors. Due to the generous support of Zeta Tau Alpha, Advanced View is designed to enhance the alignment of the fraternity sorority experience with the changing dynamics of higher education. The goal is to provide programs each month that range from new skill development to application of new concepts through exploring a variety of topics in higher education and work with fraternities and sororities. Today's program is Action Research as Professional Development. This program will explore the value of action research as a form of professional development. Participants will explore the conceptual differences between action research and experimental research. The new research priorities for the association will be shared, and possible topics for action or experimental research will be identified. My name is Becky Gleason, and I serve as the Director of Education and Curriculum Design at Zeta Tau Alpha. I have the privilege of serving as the moderator for today's program. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics for today's program. If you're hearing me now, then you already know how to connect to the audio for GoToWebinar. Just a note that the registration confirmation email you received included audio options for both computer and speakers and telephone. So if you experience any system issues, I encourage you to attempt the second option. In the main area of your computer screen, you should see today's presentation slides, and then at the upper right corner, you should have a control panel. On this panel, you can submit questions to us at any point during today's program. While some may be addressed throughout, we do have time reserved specifically at the end for Q&A. Feel free to use this question panel to report any technical issues. While some might be addressed by us, that GoToWebinar Support Center can give you more information. Also note that we'll be tracking the AdvancedView hashtag on Twitter throughout, so we encourage you to participate and share what you're learning through this tool. So we're very happy to have Dr. Joshua Schutts with us today, and he will cover his background during his presentation. So I wanted to say without further ado that I will turn it over to him.
Okay, great. Thank you, Becky, and welcome to everyone who has logged in or listened in today for what hopefully will be a valuable short little dialogue about action research and how you might consider it for your own professional development. Becky mentioned this, but if anyone needs to write down the phone number for the GoToWebinar Support Center, there it is. But I suspect that using the chat feature in the control panel, if you're having issues, will do just fine. So feel free to send any questions that you have along the way to Becky and the moderators, and they will make sure they relay those to me. And if possible, I like to always answer questions along the way. And we'll certainly have time reserved at the end for questions in general, or points of clarification and all of that. So, okay. A little bit about myself. My name is Josh Schutts. I always like to tell people I started off in my professional career in the role of primary campus fraternity and sorority advisor. Although my job and responsibilities have evolved quite differently from then until now. I like to let folks know I have 3 degrees. I got most recently my PhD in research, evaluation, statistics, and assessment from Southern Miss. Southern Miss is actually the institution I hold all of my degrees from. So I had a master's degree in student affairs and a bachelor's degree in marketing. And so I began in 2006, joined the association, and started as a campus FSA, and did that for just about 10 years until I had an opportunity to move from student affairs over to academic affairs. And so I spent some time then in the University of West Florida's Office of Institutional Effectiveness. So that was when I decided that I really liked being a researcher and an evaluator, and that some of the skills and interests I was pursuing in my doctoral program seemed to be a good fit for that side of the house. So my role then shifted really from being the primary fraternity and sorority campus-based professional to being a chapter advisor and working with headquarters and trying to advance what we do in our work from the research side of the house. So right now I hold kind of a double position. One of them is an administrative position with the university, and the other is as I put on the second bullet there, a research associate in our College of Education and Professional Studies. So I teach research and stats and assessment to students in our doctoral program here at the University of West Florida. And there's a picture of my partner, Katie, and I with our two dogs, Yoda, the one on the right, and Vader, the one on the left, our two French bulldogs that make up our family. So that's a little bit about me. And so let me transition from me to the program. So that's kind of three things that I hope that we can get out of our time together. And the first is that I hope that this program will explore in your mind the value of action research, help you conceptually differentiate between what action research might be and what experimental research might be, and that you can see the value in action research being as almost a way to develop yourself. So I think sometimes, at least I know early on in my career, I kind of saw research as very separate from professional development. And I think perhaps experimental research may feel just like that. But the neat thing about action research, when I discovered it, let's just say, not but about a year or two ago, I started to make some connections in my mind that while you can actually use this to develop yourself as well as your programs, your communities, the work that you do. So I want to spend some time obviously showing you some of the differences and walking you through kind of the basic model of action research. I suspect that few perhaps are very familiar with what it is, so maybe it will be a learning and discovery moment for all of us. And then last but not least, we mentioned this at the most recent AFA annual meeting in December in Boston. I was very fortunate to get to co-chair with Sherelle Hassel-Goodman the AFA strategic work group for its research priorities. And we kind of announced the bullet points of what they were at that meeting. And I'm working at present to get those published in Oracle and disseminated better out to the membership so that folks can understand these are what we believe the association needs to focus on in the coming years to really impact the work of our members and and advance our fraternal movement in general. So we're going to spend a little bit of time at the end going over what those 9 priorities are. And unlike perhaps the meeting in Boston where I would have just listed them, we'll explore a little bit of the context around those research topics so that perhaps if you have a desire to engage in research and study yourself, you might be inspired to align your research interest or research opportunities, be they action research model or experimental research model. You have the ability to understand how you might align those with the research priorities. And there's, I think, great value to you in doing that. One, because experts, let's say, have gotten together and suggested that these are topics that will advance our profession and the work that we do. So there's kind of that altruistic element. But then there's also the opportunity, I think, to publish and to present, and the opportunity to say that what I'm studying and what the information that I'm willing to share is valuable to Oracle, it's valuable to the AFA annual meeting, it's valuable to perspectives when you can demonstrate what your interest and its alignment with the association's perhaps priorities. So we'll spend some time at the end there. All right. There are 4 learning outcomes. The first is that I hope that by the end of this you'll be able to delineate between action research and experimental research, that you can kind of understand at least the conceptual difference between the two, that you might consider opportunities in your own work, that you might be able to identify, let's say, sources of evidence or sources of data. Data doesn't always resonate with my qualitative friends, so I like to use the word sometimes evidence. That would be valuable for an action research project if you decide to go that route where you might find evidence to support your study. and then consider these priorities, the AFA research priorities, as possible topics. So you'll see this along the way. I've kind of built a series of outlines, and we'll highlight each way so you can see as the conversation progresses where we've landed. So we're going to begin with what is action research and how is it different, and then conclude with the other two elements. Okay. So when we talk about action research, what is this? This is a type of research that, let's say, formally began in the 40s based on the work of Kurt Lewin. So if we think about experimental research, that started far earlier, right? I mean, we can trace through the philosophy of education and educational design, right? You go all the way back to the Greeks and the Renaissance folks who conducted all these true experiments. So we're not talking about this. This is certainly much newer than the research that was conducted in antiquity. And so we liken it to the work of Lewin in the 40s. Lewin, as most of you on this call may know, was a preeminent social psychologist. He is perhaps most known for giving us the equation behavior is a function of the person and their environment, the B equals PE. And that, essentially telling us that we can understand a person's behaviors and actions by thinking first about their individual characteristics and upbringing and the things that they bring to the table, and then also placing that person with all of their variables into an environment, right, that also has some form of variables in it, and that together those things might help us understand a person's behavior. So this will feel a little bit like that, largely because it takes into account the person. Formally, let's say, a gentleman by the name of Stephen Corey in 1955 at Columbia is probably the earliest known father, if you will, of action research. So it is, in this case, very modern in the 40s and 50s. A key difference, let's say, is that it encourages the practitioner or the action researcher to be in control of their own life and their own context. So you will see, if you're familiar with the kind of paradigms of quantitative and qualitative, there are definitely qualitative elements in this. There are definitely quantitative elements. So I might propose that action research is a wonderful mixed method design, and there's tremendous value in mixed method study, particularly with respect to the work that we do, right? Because it's not just theoretical. We might come up with a theoretical way to do something better, to improve a program or to improve learning or something like that. But we also, right, to be great practitioners, need to figure out how to implement that. We need to get out of the clouds and into the streets, if you will. And so one of the things that action research does is, because it centers around the practitioner themselves and the practitioner's work, is that it starts off from a place of relevance in the work that you do and in the findings that might arise from this project. So you are in the center of your own work, your own life, your own context. And there's another key element that makes action research unique, and that is that the practitioner, right, the researcher themselves, thinks about and reflects on their work. And if any of you all have been to a recent annual meeting where we've talked about high impact practices, I know we had a session a couple of years ago with Annie Carlson and Jason Bergeron and I, where we talked about Kuh's very formal notions of high impact practice in the academy and what that looks like. Authored several articles in a very recent Perspectives where we talked about the components of high impact practice. One of the key pedagogical pieces of high impact practice is reflection, whether it's students reflecting upon their learning or their experience or their values, but it's intensely grounded in reflection. That's a key element of high impact practice. So in a similar vein, action research has a high impact element to it because it involves so much reflection about your work. It's not just looking to test for differences or changes over time, or looking for themes that students or faculty or alumni or whomever you're studying might come out in a conversation or in a document analysis. But there's a critical extra piece, and it's you as the practitioner researcher, and I'm hyphenating those terms, practitioner researcher, reflecting on the work that you're doing, its improvement, the way you're improving as a professional, the way you see your skills developing, the way you see your confidences and your competencies developing. So it adds this human element where the researcher is totally engaged. It's very similar to qualitative in that the researcher is absolutely a part of the research itself. And so in that case, you see first and foremost the qualitative element of this style of research, if you will. And as you might know, experimental research, right? The researcher is very separate from the research, right? The researcher is analyzing these data, but the researcher doesn't interact with those data. That causes all sorts of fits and heartaches in experimental design when the researcher gets involved with the participants. So, to build on these thoughts, experimental and quasi-experimental, as I mentioned, normally we're researching someone else, right? The researcher is not, in fact, a part of the design. In experimental design, as you might recall, and this will be a very brief overview because this is not a research class, but one of the key elements of experimental design are that you have random assignment to some kind of condition. Treatment and control we usually talk about. And the challenge with that in a lot of our work is that some of the conditions you might want to test, some of the treatments or the programs or the effects, it's hard to say that a student was actually randomly assigned to that. In some cases, it might be unethical to randomly assign them to certain things. In other cases, they might have a predisposition to have already chosen or not chosen that program or that project, right? So I immediately come to mind living on campus, or perhaps joining a fraternity or sorority, right? So can you randomly assign a student at a campus, for example, to fraternity or sorority membership? Well, no, you can't. Despite all of our various intricate processes, essentially some will join and some will not. But there are a lot of predisposing factors that might lean a student one way or the other to wanting to join a member, one of our fraternities and sororities, right? There might be certain GPAs that they had to have attained, or certain test scores that might preclude or include them from our consideration. They might have to have a certain level of socioeconomic status, right? We pay dues usually at much higher levels than other campus student organizations. So there's probably some factors that are at play, and those are simple kind of demographic ones. There's probably other personality ones and all this, a lot of other harder to quantify things that may not make it an easy 50-50 option for a student to be, let's say, Greek or not Greek, to just use those terms in their most general form. So then we develop these things called quasi-experimental designs, and they usually involve some form of matching. A specific technique called propensity score matching tends to come to mind, where you're essentially trying to find a person's propensity to join, or to propensity to live in the residence hall, or whatever your thing that's not really random might be. And the goal then is to find, for every student who is in that group, for every student who did live in the residence hall or did join a fraternity or sorority, they have a certain series of background characteristics, personalities, whatever variables you might have. You try to essentially find a student in the other group, the group who did not do that has a very similar profile. So you take a large group of people and you reduce it to a smaller set, but it's a smaller, more similar set. And then the classic experimentalists, they've kind of come to accept those types of designs as still being valid within the experimental approach. And, and then we test it for differences. We see if learning is improved, or grades are higher, retention is stronger, whatever we might be looking to study. So that's the very classic experimental, or the more modern quasi-experimental design, which is not necessarily at odds with action research, but again, really because the researcher practitioner is at the center of this in some respect, this experimental and quasi-experimental design does not fit action research perfectly. So to do it, I guess, in the most classical sense, to to conduct action research on our work, we have to both research ourselves and we have to both research, the work that we do, the programs that we're enacting, the the differences we might be seeking, the impact of our work. Let me just say that in general. So in action research, we have no requirement for those things about random assignment or matching. And again, we reiterate that you as the practitioner are in control of your own life and your context. I mean, you show up to work every day and decide what you want to do. And you decide how to interact with this program or this experience that you might be wishing to study. And all of those things need to be considered in an action research design. The question first and foremost when you begin on an action research kind of framework is a very simple one, and it's how do I improve the work that I'm doing? And I think that that's a question we all as practitioners and scholars, whatever we might be, we all want to know that question. I mean, that's a question I think our supervisors ask us. It's a question we ask each other at our annual meetings and at conferences. And I think, we are a profession that is full of a great many folk who take pride in improving themselves and the experience that their students are having. So the nice thing about action research, right, is that it's fundamentally grounded in improvement. We intend to make things better. And in that case, I think it's uniquely positioned for the type of work that we do. And I left this off the earlier slide, but it bears mentioning. We see a lot of action research conducted in the field of education. The very classical designs of teachers trying to improve their students' experience or their students' learning. And so the teacher in their let's say their K-12 environment might be trying different approaches to the curriculum and seeing if the students learn the content better, and the students' reflection on their understanding, and the teachers' reflection on their students' understanding, and the teachers' reflection on their confidence to deliver that in that manner, right? Because some things are easier for us as the facilitator or teacher to do than other perhaps models of educating students. So it begins, largely in education. It's seen a lot in education, and I think by extension, it can find good value in our work as educators ourselves. It's also characterized by really the synthesis of two types of information. So we have, let me just say, generally assessment information and appraisal. I was having a great conversation this morning with some folks around the assessment roundtable in our College of Education. And we were talking about all these courses that get designed and all these programs and experiences that people talk about assessment. We say assessment, assessment, assessment. Well, what is assessment, right? And I think fundamentally the challenge with that word is that it's become almost a buzzword. But it's a buzzword that is very nebulously defined. If we ask 10 people what assessment is, you might get 10 different answers, and they might take you down 10 or 12 different rabbit holes. So let me say simply that assessment is just the gathering of evidence. At its most basic level, that's what it is. It doesn't have to be numeric, but it could be. It could be thematic. It could be qualitative, right? So sources of information, assessment evidence, let me say, I'm putting quotes and air quotes around the term assessment evidence, can come from myriad places, and it can be either numeric or thematic. So we're synthesizing in action research this information that we can gather, this evidence of effectiveness, whether that's learning, whether that's values articulation, whatever. It's totally going to be framed by the question that you ask as the participant researcher, by really the outcomes established for whatever that thing of study is. So we have that, and then we have appraisal, and that's the reflection piece. So it's synthesizing perhaps participant appraisal. So that's our students, our members' assessments. Not assessments, our members' reflections on the effectiveness, the learning, whatever that is. But it's also the appraisal of us, self-reflection, self-appraisal, if you will. And you'll see there's on a slide to come here in the future, It may also involve the appraisal of others. So you can see here that if you're familiar with the concept of triangulation, which is taking sources of evidence from different places, right? Different methods, different people, different types of evidence. You're taking different types of evidence in general and piecing them together in a way to say, do these things come together to tell a common story? Can I link these numbers over here with the student feedback over here with this, performance indicator that we've been tracking over here, and my own self-reflection and anecdote and observation over here, and does it all kind of make sense, right? That's triangulation. It's putting the pieces together and seeing if it looks like a comprehensible puzzle. And so we'll use that. We'll use that in the specific case of action research. We'll use that triangulation as to include the appraisal piece. And I think the other point that probably is worth mentioning before we advance on to talk about the actual method of how to go about doing action research is that your focus for action research can be on a bunch of different things, right? It's totally wide open what you could study. You might decide that you want to do action research on some processes, on some, look for the effectiveness of process and procedure in your office. Perhaps some of your work seems to be, you think that there's more efficient, more effective ways to do it. So action research can be done on those elements of process and practice and procedure. You could also look at values into practice. You could look at, the impact of a program's effectiveness on learning. You could look at the evolution of one's values, one's critical thinking, all of those types of things. So it's all wide open what you might choose to study. This is probably also a good place to note before I forget that a good bit of the content that I found, probably one of the best initial documents to review if you're interested in learning more about action research. There is an online kind of book by McNiff. That's called Action Research for Professional Development. And you can find it easily online. It's cited at the bottom of most of these slides. But a quick Google search will find you several differing opinions about what action research is, and you'll also find it within journal articles and peer-reviewed published. So it is publishable. It is you can search about it and learn more if it's something of interest to you. But I would start you off with the McNiff reference, just because I think that author does a wonderful job really summarizing it in a concise manner. Okay. So the method of going about doing action research. First, not necessarily that any of these will come as a surprise. I don't know that there's anything in here that would completely feel out of place or peculiar, but when we begin action research, we begin with a review of something, our current practice. So if our action research question is procedural or process related, right, we're going to look at what are the current practices, policies, pedagogies, whatever those might be that are in place. If we're looking at doing action research on a program for its effectiveness, right, we're going to look at what prior data we might have about it, about its improvement in learning, or what outcomes used to exist, and how often have those outcomes been revisited, and how, all of that kind of stuff. You're going to look backwards first. And in that look backwards, it is entirely likely that you will come up with some area or areas that you identify need improvement. Remember, action research is fundamentally centered on improving our practice, improving our work. And this helps you answer that first question in parentheses, which is, why are you interested? Why does this matter? Why should you care? Why is this worth your time improving? And you can imagine when you ask a series of these whys, you'll get a ton of answers for that. And the beauty is that all frames the justification, the background of an action research study, right? You're talking about the significance that current practice has been doing this. There's a gap. There's a breakdown, something, and that therefore that could be improved. And here's why it's important that that's improved. Then it adds a third element, which I think is probably the most unique to itself, and that is the notion they call imagining a way forward. This will feel almost like brainstorming, right? And there are probably plenty of ways you could go about this through traditional brainstorming, right? SWOT analyses. There's any number of probably designs out there to talk about how to brainstorm and generate a ton of ideas, right, that can be further filtered down and thought about and considered. But a piece of this, remember, because you're kind of walking through it, is you've identified this gap, and now it's what could we do about it? What are all the possible options we might consider in order to improve this practice or program or policy or whatever it is? And then when you've created this list of things and perhaps pared them down, which might be the prudent thing to do depending on how many ideas you get, it involves then trying it out, right? Seeing what happened and taking stock of what happened. So that's kind of your first analysis point. Is so I had all these ideas, I tried it out, and this was the result. And I'm thinking again, the result, right, is going to come in a lot of different ways. The result's going to come perhaps numerically. Did something improve, different than what I had before? It might come thematically and qualitatively. What was the feedback from students? What did I observe? What did what did a focus group or an interview of students or student leaders or whoever what might they suggest when I asked them about this? So I've got an initial stock of what has happened. And really, depending on whatever happened, this is where you get the opportunity to either continue down that path. Maybe it all looks good and you want to continue it on for another cycle and keep trying it with very limited modification. Or you might need to decide that you gotta go back to the drawing board of ideas and modify it more significantly, and again try it again there. So you can see that we could end up developing a loop process here, where we're imagining ways forward, we're trying, we're taking stock, we're modifying, we're trying, we're taking stock, we're modifying, so on and so on and so forth. But that monitor piece is always there, and there's always the review, and there's always the evaluation that will come at the end. And again, the appraisal piece is central here, and the way that you can triangulate what has happened, not only from the results of a program or the change of a metric or whatever that might be, but also your evolution as the practitioner, your development and growth, things that you didn't think you could do before that now you can do, new areas of opportunity for you to improve your skills, etc. All of those things are important elements. So if you were to present this in paper or poster or even via talk to someone, we see along the way two streams of things. We see your program and your ideas and what it is that you tried to change from initial problem to possible solutions to trying it out and demonstrating those results so we can evaluate the effectiveness of that. But we also get to watch concurrently your growth and development as a professional. And that's, I think, again, to tie it all back to really the impetus of why I thought this was an important topic to introduce the association to, is that it's professional development, right? I mean, if I can track my own development, then doing this kind of research, trying to improve the work that I'm already doing, that kind of thing, and being able to call it research when I tack on my own professional development, growth, and understanding, this becomes a whole lot easier, I think, for the working professional who doesn't have time to go through the full-blown experimental research, empirical study, which could be very daunting for any number of reasons, time notwithstanding, that this allows us to do our work and quantify and qualify it in a manner that helps us demonstrate impact, not just impact on our campus and our community, but impact on ourselves and our own personal growth. Okay. Okay, so action research, a few more questions here that I needed to put. Let me make sure. Did I? Yep. Okay, good. I thought I skipped a slide, but I had unfortunately duplicated it. Okay. One of the questions I think, and I identify a few other things in here, which I won't necessarily belabor most of these points, but the point about, the second point there, about considering if your work meets your own expectations is perhaps one of the first questions I would ask myself in that appraisal in that appraisal opportunity. So if you, where did you set your, what were your targets? What are your expectations from the start? And did you reach them for yourself? Did the program reach your expectations? Sure. But what were your expectations also for yourself? And that leads into kind of the third question, which is related to our values that we hold as a professional. Our personal values, our professional values, are those reflected in practice? Can we see what you value, and can we see the alignment of your professional and personal values in the work that you are doing? So in that thread that I was mentioning, kind of that second thread, the question kind of becomes, not only is your program effective, or is that you plan to study for the purpose of the action research, but how are your own goals and own values evolving over time? I mentioned that and I guess the beauty of that is that you get to set the evaluation criteria. So unlike experimental research, where evaluation criteria are often set for you, like statistical significance values and all of that kind of stuff that you get that might make some people just kind of bristle thinking about. But at the end of the day here, this is much more fluid. So you're beginning at the start of this talking about the criteria that you plan to evaluate. I mentioned that appraisal comes perhaps from the students or the participants. It might also come from you in terms of a self, or it might come from others. Here is where we talk about and understand the others. Usually, and in most good cases of quality action research, the triangulation comes from looking at results of the thing you studied, the process, the program, whatever. Your own appraisals, the self-appraisals of your own growth and development, again, based on criteria that you set, and that, the values that you bring to the table, the expectations that you bring to the table, but also kind of an external assessment. They use the term critical colleagues and refer to them as a validation group. McNiff would say usually constituted of about 4 to 10 people, and they are assisting you in this evaluation. So again, you might set some evaluation criteria. You might use that criteria with the critical colleagues who could amend it, or that could be the criteria that they're using to evaluate. Again, so you're bringing in an outside, a quote, external set of folks to also offer judgment about program or policy or procedure effectiveness, this change that you tried to test in your work, but then also to provide support about your personal growth and development. So you might, as an individual, say, I think I started here and I ended here. Here's what I think my growth is. Here's what I think my expectations were, and all that. Well, these critical colleagues are providing you feedback on that. So it's them evaluating you even on your own development. And again, you can see this is a highly collaborative process. Another reason that I think action research is of value to our field, because we are of a highly collaborative nature. And there are plenty of colleagues out there in our, in our Rolodex, right, of professional colleagues and friends and mentors that could serve as these critical colleagues and these evaluators. So you see that there's an evaluation, there's both an assessment and an evaluation component of inherent in action research. So it doesn't quite meet what we would consider a program evaluation, for those of you who are familiar with that, but it's a weird hybrid blend of research and program evaluation and self-evaluation. And so I think that you see it emerge as its own type, because it's really hard to put in one kind of box what this notion of action research is. And I probably would spend a second just also sharing with us, and I mentioned before, I belabored the point about what assessment might be. Evaluation is not the same as assessment. And again, there are plenty of types of evaluation: course, curriculum, program, self, all of that stuff. But if assessment in its most general form is the gathering of evidence, evaluation is what the assessment is used for. It is making a value judgment about effectiveness. It's a judgment about quality. Did this work? Is this a quality program, a quality improvement, a quality amount of growth, whatever that might be. And so we use assessment evidence to make evaluation decisions, which are, again, decisions, judgments of quality. The nice thing about action research is that it helps not only you develop, but it also helps others develop as well. So you, and I think here's probably some questions to ask, and I now recognize that there is a typo on the third bullet, so I ask your apologies for that. But imagine now that because you have involved critical colleagues, right, others are now invested in the evaluation of this work and of your development. You start off getting to decide what you want to investigate and what you want to improve. Okay? Because you do that, you then can understand the situation that you're faced with from a much more holistic and complete perspective, because you're diving in, right? You decided to study it, so now you're gonna dive in and you're gonna understand it better than you perhaps knew before. And that increased understanding that you get improves both how you can evaluate your effectiveness, because you know the problem better, but it also is going to help you design the changes better, right? That list of possible things we could do to improve now gets a whole lot longer because you understand the problem, the situation, the circumstance, at a higher level. And because you have more options in your toolkit of what you might do, and you've involved others in that evaluation, right? You have the opportunity, therefore, to influence these others. These critical colleagues who are on this journey with you now might have some kind of positive change in their own work, because kind of together you're working through this important situation. It might cause, for example, it might cause yourself or your critical colleagues to check the perceptions that they have about the problem against each other. So you might have come in with perceptions in some, to some degree that this is where the problem emanates from, and these would be the ideas to go forth. But others who you've invested from the start might come in with a different preconceived notion or a different preconceived set of ideas. And because of that collaborative nature, right, you get to check your situation, your biases, all of that against those of each other. And that feels a little bit like negotiation, and it rightfully is. When you get to check yourself, your beliefs and ideas and possible solutions against the perceptions of others, there might be some give and take there. And in that process, your growth and development can certainly improve, because collectively between yourself and these colleagues, these critical colleagues, you tend to agree on these criteria to evaluate, and you agree on an understanding of the situation that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts saying, I think, kind of rings true. We all together then develop a better understanding of where we are, our own personal strengths, our own professional strengths and opportunities, and opportunities for development. So it's this mutual learning then that perhaps leads to this critical colleague deciding they want to try something for themselves. So action research can build on each other. If I had a group of, let's say, 5 or 6 colleagues that I chose, and we were researching something that was important to me in my work here at UWF, and I'm taking them along on this journey with me, and I'm taking their perspectives and their perceptions and their situations and their knowledge and experience into account, and we're negotiating through these challenges kind of together, and I'm recording the progress that I'm making, and we're evaluating how effective that is, right? The people who I enlisted to help may well decide that there are things in their own life and work that could be improved. And now, because they've participated with you, they see the value of this model, and it's almost reflective. Then you become you now potentially become the critical colleague for them. So it's another example of this loop and this full circleness of how collaboration might end up working together. And now you created this cluster, right? This group that's all doing it together and all helping, aiding, and assisting and mentoring each other through this process of improvement in the work that we do. So the I becomes the we, and we collectively become a community of inquirers, all fundamentally interested in the improvement of our work, of our students' experience, and also of ourselves. Okay, so that is a general overview at this point of action research. So I think hopefully you'll see that it's an interesting design. It's similar to empirical research in some ways because of the way that it does collect numeric data, and it's also similar to qualitative research in some ways, and maybe similar to program evaluation in some ways. But I think ultimately, right, the infusion of you and perhaps a community of inquirers and their growth and development being kind of right there alongside the actual development and improvement of a program, a process, whatever, a policy, makes this inherently unique. So we spent a good bit of time dancing, I think, around the notion of finding data or finding evidence. So I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about places you might, as a busy researcher, busy action researcher and practitioner, think to find data. And I draw a lot of this part on my experience as an institutional researcher, right? So that thing that I went to do when I left the job of fraternity and sorority campus professional. So when we think about the you element in action research, there are several places that you might be able to harvest meaningful sources of data. Keeping a daily journal, weekly journal, and reflecting, that becomes a source of data that might help you go back and might help your colleagues go back and evaluate your growth and development over time as you're thinking about and reflecting each day or each week on this program that you're trying to improve or this process, whatever that is. You might look at the reports that you've created. Maybe those have gotten improved. Maybe there's data and evidence and within reports that can be harvested that provide meaningful information. You could look at time on task, how much time you're spending doing the various parts of this program or this project, right? Can you make it more efficient if efficiency is your goal or effectiveness? Maybe you perceive that there's a problem in time waste and time suck. And so those sometimes laborious things we're asked to do by our supervisors of charting our time on a weekly or whatever daily basis, we think, why should we do this? It seems like menial work, and I get it, friends. I have thought that for a long time. If you're engaged in a process of action research where you're looking to improve effectiveness in a certain program or in a certain process, looking at time on task turns out to be a really good measure because you can identify areas where time is not used the most efficiently. So that could provide some source of evidence. And again, feedback about you from those colleagues also provides great evidence about your growth and your development. So there's data sourcing from the you, and there's data sourcing from, I'm just going to call it the practice, which is the program, the project, the policy, your work, right? Whatever it is you're trying to see if it got improved. That might come, from a number of perspectives. It could come from surveys. It could come from program evaluation. If you do that even more formally and standards, maybe you're trying to improve certain things, and there's CAS standards or that could be brought in and evaluated. You might look at process flow charting. So if you're gonna improve a program, and you might be measuring time on one hand and how you're spending your time, but you might also look at the flow chart of how you get to that student leader retreat, right? Let's say that, I'm just making this up for a second, but say you were interested in improving the student leader experience through the culmination of some retreat, right? Well, there's a buildup. There's a series of processes and things you have to do to get there. And so it might be that you bring in evidence of flow charting and looking at that and being the most effective. You might look at best practices that AFA would talk about, core competencies, and looking to align the work that you're doing with those core competencies or best practices in NASPA or ACPA or whatever that might be. You might also try to bring in research that you can find in a journal maybe in Oracle, or maybe in this Journal of College Student Development, or any one of those other peer-reviewed pieces that someone has talked about improving something similar or identical to what it is you'd like to do. Maybe perspective, someone has written about that, or they've talked about it at a conference presentation. So you have, again, you have data and evidence about what could be doing, and some of that evidence is going to feel very numeric, and it's going to feel very, well, I mean, it's not say numeric because it could be thematic. It's going to feel very, help me judge if this worked, right? The monitor and evaluate and critique and review. And some of that evidence and source is going to be a lot of that background, right? What should I be doing? What is best practice? How many people out there are doing it? Can I find an exemplar model, et cetera? So the important piece here is to understand that there are three elements. First, you, which is the critical piece. Again, I can't belabor this enough, because appraisal and your own growth and development is fundamental to making action research what it is. You've got to find the data evidence that reflects you and your growth. You got the practice element, which is how you yourself, or should say the improvement to the policy, the program, et cetera. We're probably used to collecting a lot of that stuff already. And then the final source, I would just frankly call the impact element. And so that is, how can you demonstrate, did it work? Did it have a meaningful quality impact on whoever it was intended to impact? And remember, it's possible that the impact is on you, and it's also on your students or your community or whatever. So how do we do that? Well, we look at pre and post. You know, we look at both numeric, but also attitudes before, perhaps attitudes after, those personal reflections before, after. We look at, you know, we mentioned things like the critical colleagues. If they're journaling or reflecting or thinking, have they been impacted by this research study, right? How has their level of engagement caused their own practice to improve, right? That's certainly an impact from start to finish. You might look at institutional data. So my time in institutional research would tell me that there are plenty of things that the university already captures, or that the organization, if you're working for a headquarters, that it probably already captures. And so how do you get access to those? How do you get access to retention, yes or no? And to, you know, we probably do a lot of things like tracking grades and all that, but you know, if retention is some kind of outcome type of variables, demographics, participation in all these different programs that you can look to correlate in some meaningful way, right? But if you're on a campus, you have offices that are harvesting a ton of student data. And if you have the ability to access that, and you know, those folks, they do a lot of reporting to U.S. News and all of that, but very, very rarely do many offices get a chance to work with a professional who's looking to improve their practice, and that Office of Institutional Research or Effectiveness can provide meaningful data to help them demonstrate that. And I think that most of them would welcome that. It's a little bit of a change of pace from their normal work. If you're at an org level, if you're a member of a fraternity or sorority, there might be high-level org data that you're capturing. Again, program participation, chapter-level variables, all of that kind of stuff. You might also look at focus groups. You might also look at interviewing some sets of students. And I would also say never count out direct observation. As a matter of example, when I work with graduate students in institutional effectiveness, and I would work with offices who would come to me and say, I really would like your help looking at demonstrating the effectiveness of my program, right? Whatever it is. And one of the things I would do is I would task one of my student workers or my graduate students, right? I'd give them a little bit of training, right, and give them a little notebook. And I would send them into the program, right, as a non-participant observer. Just go and watch, and record, right, in your notebook, in your mind. Jot little notes down along the way about what people are thinking, and when I say what they're thinking, like you would know that, but the looks on their face, right, their reactions to things. Can you glean anything from that? What are they saying in the back of the room and the side of the room, and their small groups and those different tables? What are you hearing? You know, we do a lot of institute style programs, and you know, usually for those people who've been there before, we send them as observers in the room, right? So how do we replicate that on the campus? How do we how do we use student workers and graduate students to be these participant observers, these non-participant observers. They're just there to observe, and their field notes, those things that they've observed, can be valuable sources of evidence that don't really take a lot of your time to harvest. In fact, you're getting somebody else to do that for you. So, the takeaway is that data are everywhere. There's more data out there than any of us can probably ever seem to amass or be able to analyze, but opportunities for you to work smarter and not harder, and utilize things that you've already created or already done or have been doing for quite some time. How do you bring those into the fold as additional pieces of evidence? And I think that experimental research would make that challenging because of the types of sources that it would probably suggest are valid. The nice thing about action research is that bringing all of those different kinds of things together, again, is kind of fundamental to how it's done. So, okay. We're on the home stretch now, my friends. The final piece of conversation that I wanted to have. So we've talked again about what is action research and how is it similar and different. We've spent a little bit of time talking about data and what's all out there and what you might be able to access quite easily at very limited impact to yourself in your already busy schedule. So the next question, and I kind of saved it for the end, is, well, what might you study? And I think hopefully along the time of our little one-way conversation here, things have come to mind that you might want to improve. You might not know them in tremendous depth at the moment. You might not have all of the background needed, and that's the first place to start, if you'll recall. But odds are you've started thinking about a few things that you know could be improved. And so maybe those things fall within the guideline, let's say the guidelines, but within the purview of AFA's new research priorities. And so I wanted to end with that. If you're looking to see how that might align or where you might start, or maybe you're a graduate student and you just, you're interested in action research, but you also want to do a real paper. You want to do a paper for publication in Oracle or Perspectives. Maybe you want a dissertation topic, something like that. The nice thing about this is that, AFA has grant money available. There's grant money to be found in a lot of places. And I suspect when you're an association that has these 9 things, which I'm about to share, as kind of its key focal areas, foci, I would suspect that grants tend to align themselves with just those such topics. So I can't say explicitly because I don't sit on the grant review committee, but it would make a lot of sense to me that the things the association tends to value would be top funding priorities if you're looking for a little bit of money to help improve your work. So here are some possible topics you might choose to study. You might look at matters of effectiveness. Are you being as effective as you could be? Are the activities or the programs in your office as effective as they could be? Is your office operating as effective as it is? I mean, even the process of it, right? The physical office of whatever that is on your specific campus. What about the resources that you've been entrusted with? Are you effectively utilizing those in the most effective and perhaps efficient way? And kind of the big question, which we talk about in institutional effectiveness all the time, is how are you or how is your program contributing to the institution's mission or to the mission of the fraternity and sorority, the organization itself? Are you aligned? Are your programs and priorities aligned explicitly? And how effective are you at helping deliver on that mission? So you might decide that those are of importance to study. You might also decide that there are some matters of personal interest, just topics that seem to really get you excited, right? Whenever you're going to engage on research, you should be excited about the topic. Sometimes the excitement comes because it truly is a matter of passion and interest. Other times it's because you realize I need to improve this, and I just take pride in my work, and so I can get excited about making my life a little easier or my program a little bit better. And maybe just maybe senior administration has told you of their personal interests, whatever senior administration might be, the org CEO, the org's director of whatever, maybe the vice president of student affairs, whoever it might be. So now we'll dive into what the association thinks are important. And the first is called an examination of the chapter transformation process. And so when we think about that, we're looking for the following types of stuff, right? We talked about in that committee explanatory studies and case studies and causal modeling. There are on some of our campuses, let me just say, I can't say all of our campuses, but on many campuses somewhere across the country, there are chapters that are transforming themselves, either positively or negatively, if we're honest with ourselves. And I think, when we talked about this in committee, we thought that it would be tremendously valuable to see that process happen. What does that look like? Are there markers? Are there indicators along the way that can show us the path that the individual chapter might be on, whether that's a path to improvement and a transformation in a positive route, or whether that's a negative path, right? What can we know that might be the tipping point for change? What had to happen in order for, in all likelihood, the chapter to go from point A to point B? And we also talked about things like leading indicators, right? Precursors and predictors and all of that. So we talked about, our interest in the chapter transformation one way or the other, and what that process looks like and what we might know could predict it. A second of the 9 possible areas for research deals with preparing our members, fraternity and sorority members, for life after college, life in the postgraduate world. We talked about those key experiences that they would be getting in fraternity and sorority through their organization or through the efforts of the FS office and those professionals, and the demonstrated impact that those experiences might have on improving the fraternity and sorority members, let's just say, success post-graduation. A third area is described as the benefits of culturally based fraternities and sororities, particularly at predominantly white institutions. So we thought the committee thought it important to look at our culturally based groups as they exist on PWIs and those experiences that they're having from a retention and graduation and success perspective, but also the notion of microaggressions and how membership in our fraternity or sorority might help those students cope with the experienced microaggressions that they feel at PWIs. A fourth area is how the fraternity or sorority influences one's beliefs and actions. So that's left pretty broad, but that lets you take it down a number of different paths. How might their values, their morals, their ethics be evolving over time as influenced by their fraternity and sorority experience? And how consistent are those with perhaps fellow members or with the espoused values of an organization or an office or a university, whatever that might be? But in here you see we're looking for how it changes members' beliefs and actions. Number 5 is the programming and leadership development initiatives that a campus or an organization might deploy that are focused on the long-standing issues. Not to belabor this point, but we haven't solved hazing, alcohol, drug abuse, sexual misconduct, matters of diversity and inclusion that plague us in a negative way. So what kind of promising best practices are out there that we could be doing? What is the best practice for programming in this area, and how effective is it? What outcomes might we search for when it comes to addressing these long-standing issues? Perhaps our outcomes are miscalibrated, and if we searched for the following kinds of outcomes, right, or we might collect evidence in a certain way that can better help us demonstrate the success that we're having. Definitely worth exploration. And I think the final piece is we need to know the extent to which these long-standing issues are reflective of our actual community. A lot of times we're talking national survey, so it's the average. But to improve your own practice, you need to know the extent to which these big issues are actually happening, at the same level in your community. You might be in a community that, fortunately, is experiencing much less issue with these long-standing challenges. That's an important story to tell. Alternatively, you could be at the higher end that's driving the mean where it is, and that these issues are in fact more experienced in your community than they would be on average. And that again would guide practice and opportunities for improvement in another way. The impact of the transgender conversation is also very important. Thinking specifically, it's such a new and emerging conversation in our field that what are the implications of that conversation on policy, practice, the experience of members, and even the future research directions. So that this is a conversation the committee decided really needed to be expanded, and we needed to begin with at least these kind of initial areas: policy, practice, member experiences, etc. Number 7 tees up quite nicely for action research. As you've probably noticed, several of these are teed up quite nicely for action research, given what we've talked about so far. But we felt that it was important that we do research on the profession of fraternity and sorority itself, that we need to understand the work that we do, the best practices as a profession, not just the experiences our students or alums or whatever are having. So what are the quality, skills, and characteristics of effective professionals? Where might we continue to learn? What are those areas for continued and future learning and professional development? Looking at org behavior research or studies that are conducted on students, and how we might reimagine those studies where the student was the sample, and reimagine that where the fraternity sorority professional is the person studied. There's a ton of study in organizational behavior that we use on students, but we don't always replicate those same studies with fraternities and sororities and the professionals that do those works. So that might be of value. We talked about, actually somebody had an idea about, could we come to an understanding of the ideal or optimal ratio of professional to student on a given campus? And that's probably all over the place, but we certainly talk in the academy about faculty-student ratio. And so is there something to be said about the advisor to student ratio, the fraternity and sorority professionals on a given campus to size of community, et cetera? Looking at departure from the field as well as long-term retention to the field. What are the causes and correlates of leaving? And by contrast, what's keeping our members here? Okay, let me pause for 1 second. I got a good question that came in that asked, is there a copy of these strategic priorities somewhere? The answer to that is at present, no. They are going to come out soon from the central office. We're packaging them in a simple way for the members to easily access. And so these, let's just say these 9 will kind of be presented in that way so folks can refer back to that. This webinar is the first place they've been presented in any large set of detail to the public. And I would also suggest that these will be written about in this same kind of detail also in hopefully an upcoming issue of Oracle. So I frankly have to have the time to sit down and put them in a format acceptable to Oracle. But it would be a good place to put them there, and they're certainly important to the work of the research journal. So you will see more of them there. Okay, and then number 8, 2 left. Number 8 is the position of FSL within the larger academy. So how are we contributing, again, to the institutional goal or the organizational goal and mission? What are faculty's opinions, beliefs, and dispositions about our work, our outcomes, our students' learning, the value of us as a profession? So how do we uniquely, how are we positioned within the academy, and how might we seek to improve that? I mentioned earlier about the high impact nature of fraternity and sorority life. It's very easy to see that when done right, fraternity and sorority is a tremendously high impact experience, and knowing that, that's a language that the academy speaks. Faculty and staff on campuses know what high impact practices are, and so how do we reframe a conversation around that aspect to maybe help faculty and senior administration understand the value and nature of our work? To what extent might fraternity and sorority life hinder or support involvement in other experiences or other organizations on campus? That's a question that is meriting, right? There's some people will criticize us by saying that people join fraternity and sorority and they kind of become insulary. They move out of the residence hall, then they quit they dial back their involvement in other student organizations, whereas others might suggest that quite the opposite happens, that this is a pathway for involvement and it spurs leadership. And the truth of the matter is, I don't know that we know one way or the other, but where we fit within the academy as collaborators in general, that's an important question to have resolved one way or the other. And then the way that faculty understand student learning. Faculty measure problem solving and critical thinking and oral and written communication, and they might measure service attitudes, civic mindedness, things like that faculty's learning outcomes are aligned to. So the question that one might have if you're trying to have a conversation in the academy is, how are we taking the things that faculty on campus are already used to measuring and measure those same things in our organization? Because now we're talking about a common language. When faculty understand critical thinking and that they're used to measuring those in XYZ course, how are we in the conversation with them about measuring it in a similar way, using a similar language, right? And I think that's, again, ways that we can talk about positioning ourselves more solidly within the larger academy. And last but not least, corollaries and consequences of student engagement in FSL. So because I'm involved in fraternity and sorority life, right, what things is that related to my involvement, and what consequences might I be experiencing because of that? And that might include things, for example, as extra role behaviors. Do I go above and beyond what's expected of me because of my or related to my involvement with fraternity and sorority? Am I more committed to organizations or causes, communities? Am I more committed to my institution and more attached to my institution because of things that are happening, levels of engagement in my fraternity and sorority? Citizenship behaviors, our organizational citizenship is a concept, again, of its extra role in that it's outside my expectation, but I go above and beyond when I'm not even asked to do that. And so, again, looking there for, because I'm involved at either higher, perhaps, or lower levels of engagement with my fraternity and sorority, what might that have an impact on, right? What might we be able to correlate that with? Again, telling our story and advocating for improvements where they would best be made. So there we go. That concludes the prepared remarks that I had in my 1 hour and 15 minutes. And if we have any questions that might have come in, I would be happy to answer any questions folks might have at this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. So we'll transition to this question and answer period. So everyone feel free to enter in your questions in that panel to submit questions to him, and then he will continue answering. Thank you.
Okay. I've got one question, good, that's come in about suggestions on how to use action research when applying for university accreditation, specifically and another one is mentioned about SACS accreditation. So I think, here's what I would say about that. Accreditation is a form of evaluation. There are many types of program evaluation. Accreditation is one of those types. And so because of that, I think action research has such an evaluative nature that the improvement of your program and process over time, it kind of goes parallel. I mean, maybe that parallel is the wrong word to use, but it runs right alongside the expectations of things like university accreditation, SACS accreditation, et cetera. So SACS, that was another part of my job when I was in the Aspire office at UWF with effectiveness, is that I was also on the reaccreditation team. And I can tell you that whatever the group is, whether it's a faculty department accreditation or SACS or some university regional accrediting body, what they really want to see, they really want to see that you've identified outcomes that are meaningful, that are grounded in some kind of, they have some background, like you can explain why why they're important, and a lot of times the universities ground their outcomes in their mission, and their mission is grounded in their history and their perspective and all that kind of stuff. But you end up setting outcomes, collecting data, and making decisions for continuous improvement. And accreditation wants to know that you're methodical in that approach, right? That you've identified, significant things to improve. You've identified steps along the way to improve that. You've harvested evidence, again, broad scope assessment evidence in multiple fashions, right? Not just one data point, but multiple pieces of evidence that show the effectiveness of that thing, of your improvement effort, and that you've spent time reflecting for continuous improvement. So what would I do to change this, to make it even better based on what it is that I learned from my initial results? And the most sophisticated accreditors will really want you to not only demonstrate thoughts about continuous improvement, or these are the things that we would change, but then go one more cycle ahead in the future and document that you actually changed it and the effectiveness of that new change, right? So you could go on forever, right, constantly evaluating and changing and so on and so forth. And at some point, accreditation just says, enough is enough. But I think the most sophisticated form is to show really that whole methodology that I presented for action research, where it's coming up with these ideas, trying them out, taking stock, monitor and improve and retry it. That whole cycle right there is exactly what accreditation wants you to do. So my belief is that action research is a sophisticated way for you to demonstrate exactly the tenets of accreditation. Let's see. I've got another question here. Does AFA have a way of connecting people who are interested in conducting action research to share best practices and challenges? It's a great question. My answer at this moment would be no. I don't know that we do, formally or informally. I've been attending the association meetings, annual meetings, for I think 11 or 12 years now. I've not ever heard anyone talk about action research specifically, which is part of the reason I wanted to start this conversation. But I think that's the answer to that question is an opportunity for us. This is research that's much easier for us to be doing as a profession and as professionals. And I think that we need to take a hard look at how we build community around community and communication and connection with each other to folks who are interested in this. So I know that, I'll take liberties and now step and put my board member hat on for a second. There's conversations coming about the role of mentoring and what we might do to mentor each other in the field, and research mentoring is a part of that conversation. And I think a part of a research mentoring conversation, a subpart, might also need to then be action research or practitioner-based research. And so, I would certainly love to welcome a dialogue from more people in our membership about how we might connect people who are interested in learning more and doing more of this research. And then I think some of it is that critical colleagues piece and an individual person who says, I want to do this. I'm going to select my own critical colleague group, and we're going to just do this organically and naturally. And so it might grow in that respect too. But formalizing it is I think, a wonderful question and idea, and one and the same. Let's see. Any other resources you suggest for professionals to use when conducting research? That's a tough question, because when I put this together, I tried to think exhaustively of many places that you could probably find data from. And so I don't know that, if I'm being honest, that anything else comes to mind, with that I may not have already mentioned. I think, surveys and interviews and focus groups are great. We use a ton of them, but I think the more places that you can look at the files that you're keeping, the better, right? And wherever you can find information and data and evidence on campus or elsewhere in the organization, a lot of times that's one of those that it ends up being kind of a treasure trove. You didn't even know that it existed, and you find it, and all of a sudden it's like, it's like you've struck gold. So those are the ones I can think of now, again, in all the different various places. And again, not to belabor it, but the action research part about yourself, there are probably plenty of resources that that don't come immediately to mind that only you would have necessarily access to because they're related to you specifically. And with that action research piece really being fundamentally connected to your own growth and development, some of those questions about where to find more data might be answered by yourself in what you might have your own access to. Another question: once you have the impact, how do you tell that story of change in great ways? Well, tell the story is I think the key word there. If you can demonstrate the impact, the fact that you have a methodical process, I think that conversation about impact becomes a story that people want to hear. So I think, depending on how sophisticated the process was and your comfortability in writing, I think part of telling that story is publishing it, whether it's publishing it in Essentials, Perspectives, Oracle. That's certainly one route if you like to go the writing route. I think, obviously presenting this at AFA, right, and teeing it up as an impact study, as how it could be, how this is aligned to the AFA research priorities, or how this is aligned in this case to how action research is valuable practitioner research. Some of it is making the case in that respect and sharing that with colleagues in the presentation format, regionally, and at the AFA annual meeting. I think that's another way. I think we've got to find places beyond AFA like NASPA and ACPA and ASH, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, other venues where we have to take when we can demonstrate impact, we've got to take that to the next level and show, the other levels of audience, the faculty, the senior administration, that we do take a sophisticated approach to this as professionals, and we can show you how we've improved our practice over time. So, it probably it's as comfortable as you are with writing or speaking, but I also think that you might tell that story again more organically, face to face. If I'm thinking just with my action research lens on, when you're picking your critical colleagues, you might have a certain element of intentionality there, people that you seek to influence, people that might benefit greatly from the impact you can show them. And I think whenever you're collaborating and engaging others in your work, you have an impact on them, whether you ever wrote about it or whether you ever spoke about it at a professional conference setting. So there might be ways to tell that story of change to our colleagues just simply by allowing them the space to participate. And then I think that my final thought on that, there's a story of change that needs to be told to the people that we answer to, right? The CEOs of our organizations, the presidents, provosts, vice presidents of student affairs of our universities, and I think the action research and experimental research offers us the opportunity to do that, whether that's, a short report or a poster or a white paper or whatever that might be. But I think that story of change is also should not be lost on those key decision makers. All right, well, I've got the word that those are all the questions we've got. So I appreciate everyone spending some time this afternoon for your own professional development. I hope that you've gotten to learn a little bit of something about action research and how it might be valuable to you. And I'm honored to have been offered the opportunity to share a little bit of my thoughts and the thoughts of some others who do this work with you this afternoon. So thank you all.
Well, thank you so much. It looks like, so what you said, we're approaching the end of our time, and I wanted to wrap up and send a big thank you to Dr. Josh Schutts for taking time out of your week to really share this information about action research. I know my mind was reeling with all the things that we could do here at ZTA, and I know this has been proven really valuable information. So I want to thank every one of you for participating and sending in your questions. and for participating in this Advanced U program. So following today's session, a recording will be posted on the AFA website within a few weeks. So also all webinar participants will be sent an evaluation for today's session, and we hope that you take the time to provide us that feedback because we really use it. And so for June's Advanced U program, we will be discussing exploring transition and success in your new role. So we know the summertime is the time for those types of transitions. And we will have Melissa Kish from Indiana University and Dominic Green from American University here to discuss with us this topic, focused on graduate students and transitioning in their first role. So look for that sign-up email for that program going out today. And thank you again for your participation and for Dr. Josh Schutts. And so we hope to continue that you'll be willing to think differently and work differently through learning about new ideas and topics through the next Advanced U. Take care, everyone.